A physiology of skeletal muscle. Muscle twitch, defined, is the contraction of a muscle in response to a stimulus that causes an action potential in one or more muscle fibers. Remember, muscle fibers just means cells. So since they're long and they fuse together to make this long cylinder, we call them muscle fibers. So hypothetically, there are 3 phases to a muscle contraction. You've got the lag phase, the contraction phase, and the relaxation phase. 1, 2, 3. Contraction phase and relaxation phase are pretty simple. Contraction phase is when the muscle contracts. Duh. Relaxation phase is when the muscle relaxes. Lag phase is the one that is a little bit more complicated. So you have to remember that when you put an action potential, when you start an action potential, there's a bit of a delay between the time that the stimulus is applied to the motor neuron and when the myosin head actually attaches to the actin binding site. The motor neuron has to have an action potential travel down. Calcium channels have to open. Calcium has to go into the synaptic terminal. And then the synaptic vesicles have to release their neurotransmitter. The neurotransmitter has to go across the synaptic cleft, then bind to the ligand-gated sodium channel. The ligand-gated sodium channel has to open, and then enough sodium has to go in to cause the sarcoplasmic reticulum's voltage-gated calcium channels to open. Then calcium has to get out of the sarcoplasmic reticulum and float down to the sarcomeres, where it binds to troponin, which changes its shape, which exposes the binding sites. Then the myosin head can bind. All of those steps have to happen before any muscle movement happens, before any contraction B happens. So in theory, there is a lag in there. Now, reality, yeah, muscle contraction doesn't take that long, neither do action potentials. But in theory, all of those steps still have to happen, so we call it lag phase. An action potential, this is an electrochemical event. We're talking about the movement of the ions of sodium and potassium. So we measure that in millivolts, okay? Now, an action potential technically takes 2 milliseconds or less. So 1/500th of a second is slow for an action potential. Contraction, though, the muscle actually moving, is a mechanical event. It's a physical movement. Now, we measure that in a force called tension. We can report it as grams lifted or distance the muscle shortens, but that right there takes at least up to 1 second to occur. So even with a slow action potential, I can hit that muscle 500 times before that 1 second has elapsed. Just to kind of give you an idea of the timing of that. Now, all or none law of skeletal muscle contraction. If you have one cell that you are making contract, it contracts the same every single time. It never changes. It's like firing a gun. A gun fires the same way every time that you fire that gun. It's not like if I barely push the trigger, then the bullet goes boo, and it just falls to the ground and it doesn't actually shoot anywhere. If I push the trigger harder, it's not like the bullet comes out faster. Every time I fire a gun, it's exactly the same. Every time I have an action potential in the same cell, the same skeletal muscle fiber, it fires the same every single time. Let me make sure about something before I go on. Don't worry about that. Okay. For a given condition, once an action potential is generated, the muscle fiber contracts to produce a constant force. That's exactly what I was saying. That muscle fiber works the same way. Internal cellular conditions can alter the force of the contraction. So the only things that can really alter how hard that muscle contracts: how much calcium do I have? Am I moving enough of that troponin and tropomyosin out of the way to get a good grip? And muscle fatigue can be a lack of ATP. If I don't have enough energy, then I'm not going to be able to get the myosin heads to let go or recharge them to get them to contract. Now, a motor unit. So I'm going to go, actually, I'm not going to go back. Hang on. So remember I talked about the fibers, the different fibers, and how I've got a neuron that touches multiple fibers, but not all of them. So I've got the neuron and it touches a few of these fibers. We call this a motor unit because when this fires, when this motor neuron fires, any cell that it is touching contracts. So it acts like a unit. So we call it a motor unit because it's a movement unit. This motor neuron controls the 3 muscle cells that it's attached to. So when it fires, all 3 of those fire. This one down here that I drew is actually touching 4 muscle fibers, 4 cells. So when this one down here fires, it causes those 4 that it is touching to contract. Whole muscle. So just like we were talking about a second ago, okay? Just like we were talking about a second ago, I've got multiple motor units on a muscle. So I'm going to, where are you? Come on. Let's go here. Continue recording. You're just gonna have to watch me do what I'm gonna do. Where's the thingy? There. Okay, so when I drew the muscle earlier, I said every line was 1 cell. And then I drew the motor neuron with its axon coming down and touching multiple cells. So here's another one. And it's touching a different set of cells. And just for the sake of argument, let's say I've got this one that's just touching this 1 cell. If this one fires, it only causes 3 of these cells to contract. If this one fires, it causes 3 more to contract. If this one were to fire, it would only cause the 1 cell that it's attached to contract. So with whole muscle, it actually responds in a graded fashion, basically meaning that if I only add this one, hang on. Let me switch colors again. If I only add this one, then I'm going to get a pretty weak muscle contraction. But if I use this one plus this one, I get a better muscle contraction. If I use all 3, then I get a complete muscle contraction. As I add motor units to my contraction, the stronger my contraction gets. I promise it's not Corona. Okay. So that's what I want you to know off this slide. Don't worry about any of this down here. Now, don't worry about this for now. What I do want you to understand is this. As you contract a muscle, the tension in that muscle lessens and it gets easier to contract the muscle after the process has already started. Why? 2 things. 1, Remember the calcium that we were releasing before? Well, that calcium is still in the cell. We haven't completely taken it out of the cytoplasm of the cell. I'm sorry, the sarcoplasm of the cell. So since we haven't taken it all out of the sarcoplasm of the cell, there's still some hanging around. So it's kind of easier to get troponin to change shape to move tropomyosin. That's one. The other thing, so if you've ever been to the gym and you've worked on the pulley machine where you have to either lift something and pull it up or pull something down, there's kind of this moment where it's very, very difficult. But once you kind of get over that speed bump, it gets a little easier. Well, if you have a muscle that has already been contracting, you've kind of gotten over that initial resistance to pull already. So if you just want to continue contracting, it's actually easier because that initial resistance is actually already gotten over. So the types of muscle contraction. You've got isometric, isotonic, concentric, and eccentric. Okay, isometric. Let's say that I've got something that I know I can't lift. Let's say my car, for example, but I go to the bumper and I start using my muscles to pull. My arms technically are not going to move because I am not lifting the car. However, the actual muscle tension in the muscles in my arms is going to go up. So this is a change in muscle tension. My muscles are getting tight, but they're not actually changing length because I can't lift my car. There's no way for me to do it. That's isometric contraction. When they talk about isometrics as an exercise in the gym, this is what they're referring to. I'm getting my muscles to contract, but they're not changing in length. Now, isotonic is different. This is change in muscle length, but not tension. So if I have a teeny tiny paper clip in my hand and I bend my arm, am I really increasing the tension in that muscle? Am I like, trying to lift this paper clip? It's not that heavy. So the tension really isn't increasing as I lift the paper clip. It's just the tension that's in the muscle. But if we're talking about the length of my muscle, if my forearm is bending, the length of that muscle is getting shorter. So isotonic is change in length, but not tension. Concentric. Concentric causes the muscles to shorten and tension to increase. So in this case, let's say I'm lifting a case of water. That's very heavy. So not only am I increasing tension because this is actually something heavy that I have to lift, but because I'm lifting it and my arms are actually moving, I'm actually decreasing the length of my muscle as well. So those are those three. They're all about shortening tension. I'm lifting something or trying to lift something. Eccentric. Have you ever heard of somebody who's eccentric and they're just a little bit different, right? Okay. Eccentric is actually the exact opposite. In all of these examples, we're talking about taking our arm with our hand, don't judge me, and lifting this direction so that we're shortening this muscle so that the arm moves up. Eccentric is the exact opposite. So I've got something in my hand and I want to put it down. So that arm needs to, let's say that's the elbow, straighten out so I can put whatever it was down. So in eccentric contraction, the muscle increases in length. In other words, I'm putting my arm down and the tension decreases gradually. The best example I could think of when I first started teaching this, so my first grown-up job, right? I'm a teacher and I go out because for some reason my TV is possessed and in the middle of the night it'll turn on and the volume will go all the way up to 100. So I go to buy with my first IRS refund I go to buy a new TV and I get myself a flat screen TV. And the guy at the store is like, oh yeah, these are so light, you don't have to worry about it. So he puts it in my car. I'm like, thank you so much. And I think when I get home, I'm just going to be able to lift it. Yeah, no, that wasn't the way that worked. It was actually quite heavy for me anyway. And I had already taken half of it out of the car and the other half was still in the car, but it was a lot heavier than I expected. So I tried to put it back in the car, but you know how there's that little hump in the middle of the back seat of a car? Yeah, it wouldn't go. And it was getting heavier by the second. Well, for me personally, I just paid like $400 for a television. I wasn't just going to go, oh well, and drop it. So I gradually put it down on the ground by releasing the tension in my arms and lengthening those muscles. So eccentric, this here, is more of a relaxing the muscle so you can lengthen and decrease the tension. So muscle tone is the maintenance of steady tension for long periods of time. Asynchronous contractions. So remember those motor units we were talking about? In order to produce smooth, steady muscle contractions, we don't fire everybody at the same time. We kind of fire in an order that kind of gives us that smooth movement. Think about it. If my muscles in my back, when I want to sit up, all contracted at the same time, I would be kind of hunched over like I was doing a back bend. I just need certain ones to fire. So it's asynchronous. I don't have the same muscles contracting all day long. I kind of have one set contracting for a while and then that one relaxes and another set takes over. So it's asynchronous. It's not together. Passive and active tension. Passive tension is tension applied to a load when the muscle is stretched but not stimulated. I'm getting ready to lift this thing, but I haven't lifted it yet. There's still tension in my muscle. I've still got my muscle ready to go. I'm just not quite lifting yet. Active tension is when you are actually lifting the object. You're actually putting force behind you lifting it. Let's say we're trying to move one of the tables in the classroom. It's not like I'm going to go from completely relaxed arms to lifting the table all of a sudden. I'm going to put my hands underneath and there's going to be a certain amount of tension in the muscles in my arms. And then when I get to active, I'm actually going to lift the table. When you add those two things together, you get total tension because total tension is the sum of the two. Okay. Don't worry about that. Don't worry about length versus tension. Fatigue. So if I define fatigue, it's the decreased capacity to do work and reduced efficiency performance that normally follows a period of activity. In other words, if I'm tired, if I'm extremely tired, my muscles aren't going to work as well as they would if I was fresh and had energy and everything else. There are three main types of fatigue: psychologic, muscular, and synaptic. Psychologic fatigue, okay, I'm going to read the definition, then I'm going to explain. It involves the central nervous system and perception of exhaustion. Okay. The thought behind this is that your brain is telling you you are tired so that you don't overdo it and damage your body. If you've ever seen somebody at a finish line at a race and they're like, I can't do it. And all of a sudden their fans start going, yeah, you can do it. And they go, I can. And they start running and they end up getting to the finish, even though for a while back there, they were like, I can't. That's psychological fatigue. Their brain is saying, dude, you are so tired. But the minute their fans start going, they're like, okay, yeah, I can. And they go across the finish line. Psychologic, technically your body isn't exhausted. Now the other two, muscular and synaptic, they're a completely different story. In muscular fatigue, basically you don't have any ATP left in your muscles. If I don't have any gas left in my car, is my car going to run? No. If I don't have any ATP left in my muscles, what eventually is going to happen is cross bridges are going to form, and then I don't have any ATP to get that myosin head to fall off, which isn't a good thing. Years and years ago now, I saw it was a marathon, and the guy was exhausted and he collapsed right probably about 50 yards from the finish line, and his coach is above him screaming at him. Meanwhile, the guy is twitching on the asphalt of the street, and I'm going, okay, he just fell face first onto a street. It's not like smooth concrete. If this boy could get up, I'm sure he would. I have a feeling that that kid was suffering from muscular fatigue, and if that kid didn't get medical help, which he finally ended up realizing there was something truly wrong, he would have died. Because if you're that depleted of ATP, your body's going to stop working. Now, synaptic fatigue. All honesty, I don't think synaptic fatigue is something that actually happens in a person. I think muscular fatigue would happen first before synaptic fatigue. I think a scientist probably did this in a lab and went, oh, synaptic fatigue. So synaptic fatigue, remember that at the synaptic cleft, I'm releasing acetylcholine to get it to cause my muscle to contract. With synaptic fatigue, that synaptic terminal runs out of acetylcholine. Okay? Physiologic contracture, the muscle is incapable of contracting or relaxing because of a lack of ATP. This kind of goes back to that muscular fatigue. Literally, my muscle is frozen in place because it doesn't have any ATP left. I can't release my cross bridges. Rigor mortis is a bit different. If you've ever seen any type of crime show where a victim is in rigor mortis happens when the body freezes in the position that it's in because the muscles were in that position when the person died. Now, when you die, you stop making ATP. So to a certain extent, it's kind of a lack of ATP that's causing this to happen. But unlike physiologic contracture, this is permanent. Now, I know most people are going, okay, but rigor mortis doesn't last forever. You got to remember that if you've got somebody who has passed on, their body is already starting to decompose. So as their body starts to decompose, eventually those myosin heads that are caught are going to break. And when they break, the body relaxes. Okay, energy sources. Where do I get my energy from? ATP synthesis in your muscle has to be equal to ATP breakdown. I'm going to sneeze. I'm sorry. Okay, because really and truly, your muscles can't store huge amounts of ATP. They burn through it too fast. So I have to have ways of making ATP in my muscle to make sure that they keep running. I do this in 3 ways. I use creatinine phosphate, I use anaerobic respiration, and I use aerobic respiration. The one that we like the most is aerobic respiration. Aerobe means oxygen, okay? Anaerobic means without oxygen. Creatinine phosphate is a whole nother thing. Okay, so, or creatine, I guess it depends on how you learned it. I learned it creatinine, but creatine is also a common pronunciation for it. So you have creatine and it's got a phosphate attached to it, okay? And you have an ADP. Remember, ADP is adenosine diphosphate. We talked about this in chapter 2. All you're doing is you're taking this phosphate off and adding it here, and that creates 1 ATP. And then the creatine or creatinine actually gets released in the urine. It's a waste product. This is one of the reasons why I find it hilarious that people will go to GNC and they'll buy these huge things of creatine, because I'm like, okay, but your body makes that. You don't need to make that. And honestly, all you're going to do is pee it out because you're not using it the way that it's supposed to be used. Anyway, so the energy source in this particular vein is going to be the creatine phosphate. It's the thing that makes the ATP. Oxygen isn't required, but you only really get 1 ATP per creatine phosphate. Now, how long will this keep you alive? About 10 seconds. I'd like to live longer than that. So let's see what else we got. We have aerobic respiration. Aerobic respiration. In this case, our energy source is glucose, okay? We go through a process called glycolysis, glyco-sugar lysis breakdown, okay? So we break glucose down into 2-pyruvic acid that gets converted into 2-lactic acid. But during this process, we get a yield of 2 ATP. Now, what's my energy source? Glucose. Is oxygen required? Anaerobic respiration? No. How many ATP did I get? 2. How long will this keep me alive? About 3 minutes. Again, thinking I want to live longer than this. So, let's talk aerobic respiration, the star of the show. Aerobic respiration also uses glucose as its fuel source. And the first step is actually the same as anaerobic respiration. I do go through glycolysis, just like you would with anaerobic respiration. The thing is, that pyruvic acid that I got, I actually put it into 2 other cycles. And I can do this with fatty acids and amino acids as well. So glucose isn't the only fuel that I can use. So I still get from glycolysis 2 ATP. Then I've got something called the citric acid cycle that 2-pyruvic acid goes into. Then the product of the citric acid cycle actually goes into the electron transport chain. From the electron transport chain, I get 36 ATP. So 36 plus 2 is 38 ATP. Compared to 2 and 1, that's a boon. Honestly, if you think about it, that's like me giving you a quarter and you giving me a $20 bill. That's huge. So aerobic respiration is the one that yields the most energy, 38 ATP for 1 glucose. Now, the other thing, it's not just glucose. I can use glucose as an energy source, right? Where is my mouse? Okay. As an energy source, I can use glucose, I can use fatty acids, I can use amino acids. This is the one catch to it though. Oxygen is required. So you know that thing you do with your lungs where you breathe? This is why you do that. This is the whole reason you do it, for aerobic respiration, to make ATP. When people ask you why you have a respiratory system, this is why you have a respiratory system. Not to breathe. That doesn't have anything to do with getting oxygen into your body. Now, the yield, 38 ATP per glucose. How long will this keep you alive? Hours. This is why we love aerobic respiration. This is why aerobic respiration is like the bee's knees. We love that. Now, oxygen deficiency and recovery oxygen consumption. After you exercise, it's not like you're, woo, I'm done with Zumba, and you go, okay. Usually you're going, right? You're actually doing that for a reason. When you've been working out and you've been working your muscles as long as you have, that would be the dryer. Sorry, guys. Just ignore it. So when you've done that and you've used up all of that energy and you've used up the oxygen in your muscles that you kind of had in reserve, that extra breathing is almost like reloading. You're bringing in extra oxygen so you can distribute it back out to the muscles that use their storage. So, fast and slow twitch fibers. Not all skeletal muscles have identical functional capacities. Myosin, the little golf head that goes up, grabs and moves and then lets go, has 2 speeds. It can either be slow. Wow, that's a horrible color for blue. It can either be slow or it can be fast. Literally meaning how fast it reaches up, grabs, bends, resets, reaches up, grabs, bends, resets. How fast is that happening? So we've got either slow twitch fibers or fast twitch fibers. So in myosin slow twitch fibers, in slow, it makes them contract more slowly, but there's a catch. It also makes them resistant to fatigue. They don't tire so easily. Fast twitch fibers may work faster. They contract more quickly, but they are very fast to fatigue. You may know this as light meat and dark meat in chickens, okay? So white meat in chickens, where do you find it? The wing and the breast. This makes sense because chickens don't fly. They don't go south for the winter. So these are muscles that they use for short periods of time and then they're done. What do chickens do all day? They walk around, right? They walk around, they peck at things, they go explore, they come back to the roost, whatever. But they're walking around. So what muscles need to be resistant to fatigue, to tiring out? Well, those would be their legs and their thighs because they walk around all day. Where do you find dark meat? Legs and the thighs. So having slow twitch fibers, the red meat, the dark meat, in their legs makes sense because those are where we need them. If you think about duck for a second, duck do fly south for the winter, right? Their breast and their wing meat is actually red meat. It's dark meat, because they actually do use those for long periods of time. The effects of exercise. Muscles hypertrophy or atrophy. Hypertrophy means they swell up. Remember we said that when we were talking about the cartilage cells, right? They swell up. I don't make extra muscle cells. The cells I have just get bigger. They can also atrophy. Atrophy is when they shrink. It's almost like they become a form of muscle scar tissue. If you've ever seen somebody in a long-term coma or somebody who has very advanced Alzheimer's and they don't move anymore, their limbs kind of curl in, and one of the reasons is because of muscle atrophy. Okay? Anaerobic exercise. If I am doing anaerobic exercise, in other words, short spurts of really, really hard exercise, I'm not going for a really long time, I'm developing type 2B fibers. In other words, I'm developing fast twitch. Type 2 are fast twitch. Okay? Aerobic exercise. In that case, I'm developing slow twitch fibers. Basically, I'm turning fast twitch fibers into trained muscles that can go longer, or I'm developing my already existent type 1 slow twitch fibers. So slow twitch type 1, fast twitch type 2A. Now, if you want to, you can read through all of this, but I'm not going to make you know that for the exam. What I want you to know is slow twitch type 1 fibers, the ones that are resistant to fatigue, they are always what they are. They don't change. They don't convert into something else. If that's what the muscle is, that's what the muscle is. We primarily have those for maintaining our posture and in our legs for walking, because again, we don't fly. Fast twitch are trained fast twitch fibers. In other words, they are going to, again, they are going to tucker out faster. They're going to tucker out faster than type 1 no matter what you do. But they are trained so that they do last longer than the type 2B. These are the ones that tucker out the fastest. They're the ones like, for example, for me personally, I don't use my arms. I walk around on my legs all day. My legs could probably do quite a bit. I can walk around town for hours, but my arms, I couldn't do that with my arms. I couldn't lift things all day long with my arms without them tuckering out pretty quick. All of this detail I don't really care about. I just want you to know these things up here, okay? These are untrained fast twitch muscles, so they tucker out a lot faster. Whoops. Okay, so heat production. We know this. We talked about this when we talked about the functions. When our muscles contract, even when they relax, they're breaking down ATP. That creates heat, which heats our body up, which is why when we're cold, we tend to shiver. Smooth muscle. Okay, they're spindle shaped. Like I said, they're almond shaped. You can see that right there. Okay, they do have actin and myosin myofilaments, but they are not striated. So remember that in skeletal muscle, the actin and myosin are kind of embedded in the muscle. So they're contracting from the inside. With smooth muscle, that's not the way it's working. The smooth muscle, hang on. There. Smooth muscle has this kind of web network. When I described smooth muscle when we were going through the tissues, I told you that it's kind of like a boiled egg in fishnet stockings. This is what I was talking about. You can still see there is actin and myosin. We still have our green and our purple bands, but they're along the outer border of the cell membrane. They're not outside the cell. I don't want you to think they're outside the cell, but they're along the outside of the membrane. They're not in the sarcomeres that we saw in the skeletal muscle. So they do have a poorly developed sarcoplasmic reticulum. So it's probably not the same. They have something called calveoli that kind of function as T-tubules. Calcium does still initiate contraction, but it's a whole nother mechanism that does it. It doesn't work the same way. So, excuse me, it initiates contraction via something called calmodulin, which binds to calcium and activates an enzyme that actually transfers the phosphate. Remember I told you that the myosin heads and skeletal muscle have their own ATPase activity? Yeah, they don't here. So I actually have another enzyme that has to do this for me. Then I've got phosphatase, another enzyme that takes the phosphate off. If a smooth muscle gets a signal to relax when it's already bound, when it's already actually attached to actin, the myosin will actually go through something called catch phase, meaning that the relaxation is actually going to be pretty slow because I've got to get all of these enzymes to do what I need them to do. And yeah, it's going to take time. Whereas if it's not attached, the relaxation is actually going to be pretty fast because it's already not attached anyway. So let's look at that. All right. So, nope, that's yellow. I want something darker. All right, we have a G protein coupled receptor as one of the players. Remember, grew from Despicable Me. I've got my gamma, beta, alpha minions. I also have a calcium channel. I've got calmodulin and I've got myosin kinase. These are the players in how this contracts. So when this gets bound to, I send alpha over to the channel, the calcium channel, and I cause it to open. Calcium starts flooding into my cell. Now calcium binds to calmodulin. Calmodulin without calcium is inactive. So when it's bound, it activates. Now, what does that do? Well, when calmodulin is activated, it binds to myosin kinase. Myosin kinase is responsible for breaking the ATP down and basically charging up the myosin head. So see that I've still got a phosphate attached here? I'm going to erase all that. See how I've still got this phosphate here? So now I'm in my power stroke position. You put me up against actin, I do my power stroke. But I'm there. Even if ATP were to bind to me at this point, I can't break it down because I, as a myosin head in smooth muscle, don't have that ability. So myosin phosphatase, another enzyme, has to come along, and actually when it pops this phosphate off, it releases me from the actin. So this is a very different way of doing things. Do I still get muscle contraction? Yes. But how does it work? Really different. So I've got two types of smooth muscle, visceral smooth muscle and multi-unit. Visceral smooth muscle is more common with slow contractions. This is what we find in our digestive tract, in our reproductive tract, in our urinary tract. These are the ones that have those special cell-to-cell connections so that when contraction happens, it happens in order like a line of dominoes. So we have those special cell-to-cell connections. It can be autorhythmic. It depends on its location. I don't necessarily need my brain to tell my intestine to move things down, food down my intestine, because as it stretches, it's automatic that it's going to contract. It stretches because it's got food in it. So it contracts behind that stretch so that it'll move it forward. The synapse, where my neuron touches my muscle cell, right? They're more diffuse than what you see in skeletal muscle. So skeletal muscle has one, axon terminal per cell. Here, if I get the first cell to contract and it's a line of dominoes, the second cell will go, the third one will go. I don't have to touch every single one. If I can start with the first domino in line, everybody else follows suit. Now, multi-unit smooth muscle is more of a rapid contraction. It can occur in sheets like in blood vessels, or individual units like the erector pili that gives us goosebumps, or single cells, which usually is going to be like in capsules in the spleen. These are more independent in how they work. So you don't really see a lot of special cell-to-cell connections like gap junctions. These are mostly stimulated by nerves and hormones, and because they're independent cells, the synapse actually does resemble more skeletal muscle, where I've got an axon terminal touching every cell. Because like I said, every cell is more independent. It doesn't work as a unit like what you see in visceral smooth muscle. The electrical properties, the resting membrane potential isn't as negative. And you know how in our action potential we saw that, it was real quick to go positive and negative. Here, this is kind of slow. It's a lot slower. It's not going to be that quick and you're done. Spontaneous contraction can result from sodium and calcium leakage into the cell. Both are kind of involved in depolarization here. They can have pacemaker cells, though, basically setting their own rhythm. And I already said this, but nervous system and hormone can control the contractions. Some local chemicals can as well. For example, when your stomach is emptying into your intestine actually sends chemical signals back to your stomach to get it to stop moving for a little bit so that the intestine can process what it's already been given. So that's more of a local chemical thing than coming from your nervous system or coming from your endocrine system. Okay. 4 functional properties that you see in smooth muscle that you don't see in skeletal muscle. 1, it can be autorhythmic. It can contract on its own without having a nerve tell it what to do, a motor neuron tell it what to do. It maintains steady tension for long periods of time. If I'm in a room and the light in the room doesn't change all day long, my pupil is going to stay the same size all day long. There's no reason for it to change. So it can stay that way for 18 hours if I'm in a room for 18 hours. The force of smooth muscle contraction, how hard does it contract? Well, it's pretty constant, actually. It doesn't contract and like squeeze really hard. It just contracts and changes its size, the same tension the entire time. It doesn't like squeeze real tight. And And especially when we're talking about like your digestive system, when you swallow food and your food tube, your esophagus stretches, it automatically responds by squeezing. So it contracts in response to that stretch when you swallow your food. Something else that's interesting, it doesn't develop oxygen debt. So you know how after we exercise because you've been exercising, that doesn't happen with smooth muscle. So if my eyes, iris in my eyes have kept my pupil the same size for 18 hours because I've been in the same room for 18 hours today, it's not like I have to breathe heavy to replace the oxygen in that smooth muscle because it's been contracting all day. Smooth muscle is involuntary. Don't worry about that. Hormones are important in smooth muscle regulation. Don't worry about that. Cardiac muscle. To be honest, we're going to talk about cardiac muscle in a lot more detail in chapter 20, but also, to be honest, it's pretty much skeletal muscle. The way that the skeletal muscle works, as far as the troponin and tropomyosin and the sarcoplasmic reticulum and all of that, it's exactly the same. It's a carbon copy. One of the differences, it's involuntary. I don't control my heart rate. My body does that. I don't have anything to do with it. It can be influenced by the autonomic nervous system, our fight or flight system. If something scares me, my heartbeat is going to speed up. If I see, so a friend of mine lives in Washington State, and she was on her Skype, and yeah, she's having conversation, and all of a sudden she like stopped. And I was like, what's going on? She saw a cougar in her backyard. Pretty sure if that were to happen to me, my heart rate would speed up like nobody's business, right? So fight or flight can actually influence your response. The muscle fibers are striated, just like skeletal muscle. They have a single nucleus and they are connected by intercalated discs. We talked about this at the beginning. And it is capable of autorhythmicity. Your heart doesn't need your brain to tell it anything to keep beating. As long as the heart gets oxygen, it'll continue beating whether your brain is there or not. Okay, the effects of aging. Aging in skeletal muscle is associated with reduced muscle mass, increased response time, increased time that the muscle takes to contract in response to stimuli. You get slower as you get older. Everything goes downhill as we age. We tend to lose muscle mass. One of the reasons for that is because we tend to get more sedentary as we get older. Instead of going to the gym, we're like, dude, I'm retired. This is the reason I retired, so I didn't have to do this. Well, you start losing muscle mass. You start getting slower, so responding to something in a timely manner, your muscles responding to something in a timely manner kind of ends. The muscle fibers decrease in number. The motor units decrease in number, and recovery time takes longer. So if you damage yourself as an elderly person, if you damage your muscles, it's going to take you longer to basically heal. And because you're losing fibers and you're losing the connections to your nervous system, this and this actually have to do why this slows down. It has to do with that. Okay, so that is the end of chapter 9.